And our witnesses this morning are John Apter, who is National Chair of the Police Federation, and Paddy Tipping, who is Chair of the Association of Police and Crime Commissioners. Welcome to you both. Good morning.
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 Can we start by looking at the actual policing of all the coronavirus restrictions that have had to be put in place over the last few months, and get, in a general way, your overview of how well policing these restrictions has gone, and what are the basic challenges, the main challenges of enforcing these measures that you feel you've been facing. Who would like to go first?
Perhaps, Anne, if I just take an overview, and then John is much more hands-on and on the ground, and will tell it, as John always does, as it is. Look, it's been an extraordinary time. It's been a long crisis. The police are used to handling crisis, but this has gone on for 9 months and will go forward into the future. I think the general view is that the police have done reasonably well. John, I guess, will talk about tiredness and fatigue amongst police officers. It's been quite an interesting discussion with the Home Office. The Policing Minister, the Home Secretary, believes very strongly that the police major focus should be a fight against crime, reducing homicide, serious violence. If the last 9 months has taught us anything, it's that policing is much more than fighting crime. I think the emphasis that the police have had right from the beginning around the 4 E's, engage, explain, encourage, and then enforce, has been the right way forward. We've always policed here in the United Kingdom by consent, and I think chief constables right from the start were keen to engage with people rather than enforcing. And I guess we'll come to that point later on, Anne.
Right. Okay. Mr. Apter, do you want to come in there?
Yes, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to speak with you and members of the committee on behalf of the 130,000 police officers we represent across England and Wales. And I agree with Paddy. This has been, I mean, it's been said many, many times. This has been the most unprecedented of times, not only for policing, but for the whole country. And I think it's important we recognise that. I think for policing, I think we've absolutely stepped up to the plate during this crisis. I couldn't be more proud of my colleagues, the way they've reacted to the very rapid changes in legislation, some of the very unfair criticism in national media, accepting that we don't always get it right. But I think we can be forgiven because, first of all, policing is complex at the best of times, and we are dealing with people in very often very dire situations. And there will obviously be times when it doesn't go as we would all want. But in the main, my colleagues have absolutely performed in an incredible way, responding dynamically to an ever-changing landscape. And the way that they police has changed fundamentally, certainly early on in this crisis, when the announcement was made going into the first full lockdown. It was unheard of. None of us in policing, I've been a police officer for now 28 years, I've never, ever been expected to police in this way. There was a real concern that, as Paddy says, we police by consent. How would this work with the public? I think the 4 E's approach from the National Chiefs Council was absolutely the right thing to do. But it's also come with its difficulties. The ever-changing landscape of legislation, certainly early on in the crisis, Chair, we, the Police Federation, were heavily involved in discussions with the National Chiefs Council, the Home Office and wider government. Unfortunately, as time went on, that could have been better, those interactions. My personal engagement with the Home Secretary, the Policing Minister, Paddy Tipping and his colleagues, and other leadership within policing has been really positive. But sometimes our concerns, and if you'll allow me, if I can give a couple of examples, our concerns for policing which were absolutely understood by the Home Office, but didn't seem to filter through to number 10 and beyond. So as the first lockdown was coming to an end, the announcement was going to be made that the pubs and other establishments would open up on the 4th of July. The way that message was delivered, it really did feel to my colleagues, there was so much concern in policing that was almost a green light for party time. The announcement was made ahead of the 4th of July, which was a Saturday. We asked the Home Office, National Chiefs Council, and whoever would listen to us, please, please, please do not relax the rules on a Saturday, and especially in the way that it was done, warm weather. And what that told us, unfortunately, our concerns were ignored. What that then showed us that weekend, we did see alcohol and social distancing not mixing, predictable, and it was warned about. So that was a real concern. And the same then happened when the rule of 6 was announced in September. So the rule of 6 was announced that it was coming in on the Monday, but on the Monday in a date in September, but it was announced the week before. So that again made people want to, in effect, have a bit of the last hurrah, get together with their friends and family. Now, I understand that, Chair. I completely understand why people would want to get together with loved ones, but that put immense pressure on policing, who by now were dealing with all of the normal types of crime that we'd not seen during the first lockdown, and we were policing the pandemic. And at the same time, just to add, during lockdown, assaults on police officers increased by 21%. So the pressure was really on. It was really on. But that being said, I couldn't be more proud of the way that we stepped up. And I think the vast majority of the public supported the way that we police it and continue to do so. But it has not been without its challenges, which some of them, not all, but some of them could have been avoided.
You're saying that interaction and talking to police commissioners, ministers was good up to a point. But then when it came to some of the critical issues that you've just been talking about in terms of pub openings, that interaction, that coming to you for advice was just not there. Is that the same?
Yes, I think we were being listened to, and I think certainly in conversations with senior ministers within the Home Office, right up to the Home Secretary, there was a real understanding of what we were trying to say, that the pressure was going to be on. But unfortunately, decisions were made that we felt as the body that represents officers who were there picking up the pieces, that maybe those concerns were not as loud as some of the other concerns, maybe opening some of the bars and restaurants because of the economic pressures, which I completely understand, but it did add an intolerable amount of pressure on colleagues over those peak times.
Paddy Tipping, do you want to add something there?
I'll just make another point that John hasn't made. So the crisis was run by a cabinet committee, a gold group. There was no senior police officer on that gold group right at the beginning. And after quite a lot of pressure and some reluctance, Martin Hewitt, who is the chair of the Police Chiefs Council, was put on the committee. And I think it would have been helpful, and right from the start, really at those strategic big issue discussions, if the police's views could have been fed in. And I think just slightly moving the focus, some of the comments made by ministers, not naming any in particular, that there should be greater enforcement, the police should use their powers more directly, actually runs counter to the legislative framework in this country. Decisions about operational policing are a matter for chief constables, and having a chorus coming from the cabinet actually wasn't very helpful at times.
Okay, I think we'll come on to that in more detail now. I'm going to ask Lord Fawkes to come in there.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning to you both. I want to ask you, if I may, a bit about legal clarity. You, the police, had to decide some rather difficult things, whether something was legally enforceable or whether was merely guidance. Did the police always have it clear in their minds what the distinction was, and did they feel that the public similarly were also clear about this? And generally, how did you find the business of policing what is guidance? And can you help us perhaps with any other situations in which you've had to, your officers have had to deal with guidance rather than actual offences?
So, Lord Foltz, a good example is the social distancing rule, the 2-metre rule. That's clearly guidance, but it's clear to me that the general public didn't understand that. During the pandemic, calls to the call room, the control room, the police control room, had gone up at one point by nearly 100%. And as they put it here in Nottinghamshire, it was people dobbing each other in, and there was a lack of understanding that on the 2-metre rule, for example, this wasn't a matter for the police, it was merely guidance. I think in fairness, early doors, right at the beginning of the pandemic, a few police officers really didn't get it, but the vast majority did. There was an enormous effort across all police forces, speak particularly about Nottinghamshire, trying to ensure that police officers understood the difference between what was enforceable and what was merely guidance. And we might come to, how police were informed about these things during the course of our discussions.
John Apter.
Yes, I think that's a really important point. And no, the guidance versus legislation was not always clear, and it certainly wasn't always clear to policing. And the difficulty we had, because understandable, but because of the speed of legislation being introduced, then very often we would have situations where the legislation had been enacted, but my colleagues on the ground hadn't had the guidance, what was expected of them. And if I can give you an example, so at the moment we have the tier 2, tier 3 and so on. So the legislation, the guidance is here. So tier 3 is 14 pages of rules and guidance and legislation. Now, police officers are human beings. Of course, this is new legislation, and there was always going to be a rub to get it right and to try and do the right thing by the public, save people from this horrible virus. But at the same time, we had a narrative from some media where my colleagues have used the expression time and time again, they were damned if they did and damned if they didn't. Sometimes the interaction where they had with the public, they were criticised for not being forceful enough, and others would say that you were being too heavy-handed. The social distancing that Paddy talks about is a prime example. I lost count of the amount of times I said on national media that the social distancing was not legally enforceable. Police officers were not walking around the parks and would take measures. It was about trying to educate the public. But unfortunately, that message was very often lost. And police officers were being criticised for not enforcing something which simply was not enforceable.
Lord Foltz, do you want to follow up there?
Yeah. Do you think there was something wrong with the word guidance? This is something that's emerged during our inquiry, whether advice or something more gentle and obviously distinct from a criminal offence might have been used.
Well, I think there is a point there, Lord Foltz, but I just think we need to remember that the vast majority of people have acted reasonably and responsibly, and it's a small minority that have caused the problems. And as John has said, guidance wasn't very clear, both to the general public and in the early days to the forces themselves.
John Apter?
Yes, if I could add, I think also let's not forget that police officers historically, up until this crisis, we are trained in a very different way to what has happened this year. We've had to think differently. Even the training that we're doing virtually online has changed. The speed of which my colleagues have had to adopt, understand and deliver this legislation has been unprecedented. I think the problem that we have in society, but it's an understandable one, is we really focus on where it went wrong, but we don't look at where we got it right. And the vast majority of the times, not only did we as in policing, get it right, but the public have complied with the rules and the guidance. The vast majority, that silent majority, the ones who either through naivety or just don't understand the rules, or that hardcore of people who, no matter what the rules are, they will breach them. And unfortunately, that seems to be increasing. We focus on them understandably because we want to get things right. So I think the problem in this crisis has been the legislation and guidance have come at different times. In normal times, I think everybody that I represent would understand the guidance versus legislation. But because there was an insatiable appetite to focus on it from certainly some media, some politicians, understandably, the public, then some mistakes happened, but it was a tiny, tiny minority of the tens of thousands of interactions that my colleagues have every day and continue to have.
Thank you very much.
Lord Beath.
I was very struck when Mr. Apter said that he'd never before been expected to police in this way. Is there a danger that we permanently change the relationship between the public and the police in circumstances where a police officer is having to do something he never had to do before? Ask somebody whether their exercise they're engaged in is a legitimate exercise which falls within the law. I'm talking now about law, not just about guidance. Talking to someone about whether the people they're with are part of their linked family group or not, in which case they're falling foul of one of the restrictions. This is a very different kind of engagement with the public than police officers have been expected to do in the past. Is there a risk that it has a permanent effect?
I think that's such an important point that we must not ignore. I've been a police officer for a long time. I love being part of policing family. I'm proud to be part of policing, and I know many of my colleagues are. We are policing in a very, very different way than we've ever done before. And there has been concern. I've spoken to many colleagues who have a real concern that the style of policing, or what we're expected to do and the questions we're expected to ask, could damage our relationship with the public. I think we still have the vast majority of the public who understand that we're all in a really difficult place and we're trying to do our best. But I do think there'll come a point, and we need the help of everybody in this, from government, from yourselves, from the media, if they're willing, to almost recalibrate that relationship between police and the public. It's certainly not strained to a point where it is broken beyond repair. You look at the television screens and you see some of the protests and you would think that it is. It's not. The vast majority of the public are still with us, but there is always that risk. And I think what we're going through at the moment, and there is a concern that with the introduction of a vaccine, and we all hope and pray that it will do what we hope, but some people think that the problem is over. It's not. My colleagues are still out there policing this pandemic, doing the best they can. The NHS is still under pressure. We can't sit back and relax, but we have to make sure that that relationship, which is so fundamentally important, is protected.
Paddy Tipping.
So Alan, again, I think you raised a really important point. And again, I'm keen to stress that the focus has been on the 4 E's, engage and explain rather than enforce, right from the beginning, right across policing. Colleagues were clear that they didn't want to change the nature of the relationship. And I don't think public attitudes have changed a great deal. We survey people here in Nottinghamshire who've had contact with the police fairly regularly. 50% of people, or just over 50% of people here in Nottinghamshire, are satisfied with the way that the police have handled the situation. Just 13% were not satisfied. A lot of don't knows in there, but again, I think careful, thoughtful policing has been the keynote throughout this, and I'd be very surprised in the long term if there was a change in that relationship.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lord Sherburn, can I bring you in now?
Thank you. both our witnesses have highlighted the problems which arise from the complexity of the legislation, the fact that it's been very fast moving, and also the problems of the distinction between guidance and law. I want to ask a very practical question, which is, this has obviously presented a tremendous challenge for getting people, the police on the front line, to understand what the rules are, what the law is, what the guidance is in such a fast moving situation. How have you communicated this to get this information to the police on the front line? How difficult has it been? And if you were looking forward with the experience and benefit of hindsight, what do you think could be done better in a future position?
Paddy Tipping.
Perhaps, Lord Chairman, I should start. The regulations changed rapidly and quickly, and there's no point having discussions if we're not open and straight with people. Often the regulations had changed and the police had not had the advice. The advice came principally from the National Police Chiefs Council, aided and helped most particularly by the College of Policing. So the College of Policing produced a good deal of literature around what should and shouldn't be done. But very often it wasn't in the hands of police officers at the right time. Often came very late. Sometimes it didn't come at all until after the new regulations were in place. As John has said, the regulations are large and complex. Most police forces have used new technology, use the mobile phones, put things on apps that are in officers' hands, but it has been quite a difficult situation, the lack of forewarning of changes of rules.
John Apter.
Yes, on a very practical level, the way that police officers hear about the changing legislation and guidance is generally, as Paddy says, through the College of Policing with PowerPoint presentations on shift briefings. It's sent to them via email. I did have a number of officers who said that they were learning of changes in legislation through the media, because obviously with shift patterns, not everybody is at work at the same time. And certainly early on, and this is my plea to the College of Policing and National Chiefs Council and the Home Office, early on in this crisis, we were very heavily engaged with the messages that were being delivered to our colleagues. And our message was really clear. Of course, we have the legislation, which is complex at times, but the guidance didn't have to be as complicated. It's about keeping it as simple as possible, and then we can build on that. Early in the crisis, that was very much the method that was used. As time went on, I don't believe that we were listened to as much as we could have been, and the guidance then became incredibly complicated. And what police officers on the street don't have is time. They are up against it, especially at the moment where all levels of crime and demand has risen, to pre-crisis, pre-pandemic levels. It's a real challenge. Do I think that we've adapted well? Yes, I do. I really do. But it's not perfect. It's far from perfect. And I genuinely don't know what we can do to make that better. Better use of technology. It would be ideal for the legislation to be slowed down, but we are reacting to a crisis and we can't do that. So it has been very challenging, and police officers were out on the street very often without the guidance they needed to manage the legislation versus the guidance. So it has been a real challenge. What's underpinned everything we've done is the 4 E's. And I think that really has prevented an awful lot of pressure, with that relationship between my colleagues and the public. But the rapid changes have been very problematic in legislation.
Lord Chairman.
Could I come in with just one more question? If I were a police officer on the ground, I was a police constable, how would I hear the news, I hear the Prime Minister, or I see a press conference, or I hear some how would I have received the information about what the rules were? How would I get that information?
Yeah,
So-
thank you. Oh, sorry, Paddy.
You go first, John.
Okay, I mean, police officers who are out and about, response officers primarily, but not exclusively, they would have got the information on shift briefings. So when you generally, when you start work, you have a briefing with your team, with your supervisors, your sergeants, and there will be PowerPoint presentations. You'll be sent it via email as well. And that's as simple as it can be. In some cases, not all. There'll also be more and more information sent out through the College of Policing via apps. But it's for officers, they need to be fed the information, certainly on the shift briefings. They don't always get it, but that's primarily for an officer on the street. That's how they would get these briefings.
Paddy?
And in addition, most police forces have their own intranet. All the regulations are up on there. All the advice is up on there. And officers are invited to ask questions because it's a complicated area. But most officers now have the benefit of handheld devices. A lot of information can be passed to them in that kind of way.
But it must be time consuming for individual officers and detract from the amount of time that they can be out on the job.
Well, I think that's exactly right. And John made the point earlier on that crime levels now are back to where they were before the pandemic. In the early days of the lockdown, crime was running roughly 20% less than the norm. So in effect, the police had time to do some more things. So a lot of warrants were served during that period. The number of people arrested for drug offences went up. So there were some benefits from reduced crime during the lockdown, but it was made up by other duties.
Right, let's move on then. Lord Wallace.
Yeah, just perhaps explore more on this, on how getting information through. And your views, I think, been very interesting just to learn just how it works. And the words speed of legislation have been used, not just speed, but the changes in legislation. I'm also interested in, we've talked about how it gets to the policeman on the front, policeman or policewoman on the front line. How does it get to those within the police authorities who are having to prepare that guidance and that information to go to the front line? I mean, is there time? What length of time has been given from government for that to feed through? Maybe you take the example of last week when the national lockdown ended and we moved to tiers 2 and 3. How much time was given then to prepare? Given, I think Mr. Apter pointed out, 13 pages worth, 14 pages worth for the rules for tier 3. I'm just interested to know what the timings are at different levels. And just a further point, Mr. Apter mentioned very early on, sometimes there's been too much time in terms of announcements being made ahead of, for example, the opening of the pubs and the changes in the rule of 6 in September. And is that a problem of public announcements being made without actually the detail of it being fed in or being fed down to those of you who are having to implement it?
Who wants to go first?
I think if I pick that up, if I may, as far as when do we get the notification, it can be, if we're lucky, about 36 hours generally between the legislation being discussed, finalised, being enacted, and that will then come into place. But we won't then get the guidance maybe for a day or two later, and that then causes the issues. I know that the National Chiefs Council are within the discussions of the legislation. Sometimes we will look at legislation and from a police officer on the street perspective think parts of that are simply unenforceable. We are asking officers to perform the impossible, and that can be a real issue as well, which is why I think that the way that it's then reported, some of the good legislation, which is, well, good legislation. As a police officer, obviously all legislation is good, but some of the legislation which is easier to enforce and easier to explain to the public, some of that gets lost. And then when it comes to the announcements being made, you know, for the rule of 6 and then the 4th of July, look, I'm being very selfish for policing, because I know, I predicted, along with many of my colleagues, that the pressure that would put on policing for that weekend, and that's exactly what's happened. I don't dismiss the need for the economy to start moving, but it would be wrong of me not to highlight the pressures on policing that creates public order incidents when announcements are made, and the build-up. I mean, I think on the 4th of July it was labelled by the press as Super Saturday, the 4th of July. That, you know, and I policed that weekend. I went out in uniform, policed that weekend, and it was manic. You know, the public when they drink, understandably, social distancing goes out of the window. And when police officers are seen as being the villains of this pandemic, which sadly sometimes have been painted in trying to keep people safe, that can ignite a public order situation. So all as we wanted in that time period was a bit of understanding from the government that when these announcements are made, there are consequences, certainly in this case for policing.
So just focusing on Super Saturday, it was also called in the press Freedom Day, and John has rightly pointed out the consequences of that. But Lord Wallace, you asked about how things happen in a force. As I said earlier on, the police are used to crises and handling difficult situations. When that happens, they normally set up what's called a gold group, a command group, with a senior officer in charge. Here in Nottinghamshire, it was Assistant Chief Constable Kate Maynell, who's done a remarkable job. It's taken a large proportion of her time, but she ran a regular daily blog that was available for the force. On a number of occasions in her blog, she said, new regulations are coming in. I can't tell you what the details are at the moment. I'll have to come back to you. And that's the kind of difficulty that the force has changed. We're being asked to police an uncertain and difficult situation.
I've got huge sympathy for the points you've been making, not least about Super Saturday, so-called. Do you think any lessons have been learned from that? I mean, there was also the September rule of 6. I mean, do you feel that message got through? And if we were in a similar situation coming up, it would be handled more sensitively?
And indeed, Christmas.
Indeed.
So there's been a lot of discussion, Lord Wallace, around Christmas and policing Christmas. I think over the months, the government have woken up to the idea, or been more receptive of the idea of the police being involved in these discussions at an earlier day. And when there was some talk about Christmas being relaxed, there were a number of articles and quite a lot of controversy about the police knocking on people's doors on Christmas Day. Look, it isn't going to happen, and people create unrealistic expectations of the police.
John Apter?
Yes, I couldn't agree more. I think some of the commentary that's come out about Christmas in particular, and we haven't even really started talking about New Year, but the pressure that puts on my colleagues who are going to be policing around Christmas, which will be, for many families, a very emotive day, because many of them might not have seen each other for a long time. But my colleagues, who I've said before, but I'll repeat it, have been vilified by some, are now being painted as these individuals who are going to be going and knocking on doors at Christmas, on Christmas Day, to count how many people are sitting around the dinner table. It's unfair, and it adds a level of pressure onto my colleagues who are already feeling very battered and bruised and very tired, like many others through this pandemic. But it certainly doesn't help the narrative. So yes, it's been a real challenging time.
Lord Beith.
Point's been covered.
Okay, Baroness Drake.
Thank you. On the issue of the speed or the timing with which police can get guidance, the National Police Chiefs Council, when they gave their evidence to the Commons Home Affairs Committee, actually said in the preparing of the Tier 2 and 3 regulations, they had a better experience, they got prior consultation on the regulations, they had more time to draft up guidance to the police. Was that your experience? Did you see a material difference in respect of the guidance and preparation for Tier 2 and 3 regulations? Did that trickle down to your experience, Mr. Apter?
Sorry.
Certainly from those we represent, no, there was no difference felt. It was still, accepting that there were constructive conversations ongoing, but that time lag and that pressure when the tiered situations were announced, and the tiered situations adds a whole different range of complexities and pressures on policing. You know, some forces have got different tiers within their own forces, so we have to police in a different way. So I don't doubt that the National Chiefs Council were having a more constructive dialogue. But unfortunately, the Police Federation, who represents, as I say, 130,000 police officers who are at the forefront of this, that dialogue has not been as full on as it could or should have been, which I think is disappointing.
Paddy Tipping, your area has had part of it in part 2, part of it in part 3. I think you're all in part 3 now, but you've got an experience of differences at different times.
Yes, that's the case. Just replying to the original question, I think over a period of time, relationships or communication between ministers, officials and senior police officers has improved. I don't think that's in question, but John has rightly said, has that translated down onto the ground? No, I don't think it has, to be perfectly honest. I smiled a bit about the evidence that was given by the APCC at the Home Affairs Select Committee. It was interesting that chief constables, when asked directly what the rules were in their area on that particular day, had some difficulty in explaining it. And I think that reflects the problem. There's been enormous controversy here in Nottinghamshire, and I guess it will occur again in the Commons when the 16th of December comes up, about what people call the granularity of the restrictions. The police's view, very strongly, is to have wider areas if possible. So here in Nottinghamshire, the notion of having different tiers in different district councils has been really quite difficult, and people are very strongly against that. But again, John has stressed the political involvement in some of these discussions, and I think it will be a hard discussion that we will face again on the 16th of December.
And it's Drake, did you want to follow up at all?
No, that deals with the point. Thank you.
Right.
Chair,
in that case,
yes. Would you like just to add one quick point on this? The reason why I'm so passionate about the Police Federation being involved, both at a local and national level in these discussions, is because we're there to help and support. It's not about being obstructive or difficult. It's about making, whether it's the legislation or guidance, land more effectively with our colleagues. So we have a branch of networks of federations across England and Wales, and every one of those branches are well connected and working closely with the chief officer teams of the PCCs or the commissioners or the mayor's office. And we're there to be a constructive ally in working together in what is this unprecedented crisis. So that's why I'm so passionate about this. It's not about being obstructive or difficult. It's about being positive and hopefully making sure we can land these messages as well as we can in the circumstances.
Certainly. Thank you. Baroness Corston, I'm going to bring you in at this stage if you'll unmute.
Thank you. Looking to the future, is there anything that the government should be doing differently in terms of notifying the police and the public at large of the new measures and ensuring that they are clearly understood?
So I think, Jean, one of the points that both John and I have been keen to make to you is having good notice of changes. As I said earlier on, I think lessons have been learned during the past 9 months, and better communications are taking place between officials, ministers and senior police officers. I guess the point that John will make, and he always makes it very strongly himself, is does that gravitate down, right down to a local level? And I think that's where we need to do some more thinking.
I would completely agree. I think sometimes in the busyness of a crisis, the simple things sometimes get forgotten about who to engage with, who to talk with. The Police Federation, we have a constructive dialogue with the Home Office, with government, with chief officers. We might not always agree, but generally we'll want the same thing, especially throughout this crisis. So what I would like to see lessons learned coming from this is certainly for the body that represents police officers, and I'm sure the Superintendents Association would feel the same, it's just about being not an afterthought in some cases. It's being brought into that circle of trust about what we're trying to achieve, how we want to achieve it, and what would our view be on making sure that it would land with our colleagues, who after all are the ones expected to police this 24/7.
Thank you. Baroness Fuchs, did you want to follow up there?
Yes, I would like to. I was a bit shocked when I gathered that the regulations and the guidance to them could be several days apart. That seems to me particularly worrying for anyone at the front line. Is there any way in the future when what the front line officers really need to do could be presented to them more rapidly and perhaps more simply?
I think the word you use there is more simply. I think sometimes, and look, I'm not naive, legislation is never simple, but I think sometimes with the guidance, we overcomplicate it, which is to the detriment of us trying to get out there and actually police this pandemic. I think lessons are being learned as we move along, and it's not ideal, it's far from ideal that we see the legislation and the guidance being delivered so far apart, because that puts pressure on my colleagues. I do appreciate that this is an unprecedented time. It's not the norm, which is a good thing, but I think simplicity is the key. Not to water down guidance to a point that it makes it irrelevant, but I think there is a balance to be struck. That's the message that the Police Federation has been giving throughout this whole pandemic. Early on, I think we were there. We feel we were in a better place with that. But I think as time's moved on, it's been a bit more overcomplicated. Maybe that's because the legislation and the tiering system and the geographical boundaries and the devolution and so on has made it more complicated. But that doesn't help my colleagues on the ground floor.
Paddy Tipping?
So John's made the essential point that the simpler the message is, the better it was. So right at the beginning of lockdown, stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives, was a message we all got, we all understood. There was unanimity between policing it and the general public. As we've moved forward, the messages have got more diffuse, more difficult, and much harder for frontline officers to police. So I think simplicity is the watchword, and I think Baroness Fuchs, the situation that we had on a couple of occasions where the guidance came out some days after the changes really wasn't acceptable. We have moved on from that. We are in a better position, but let's be clear, at the time, it wasn't good.
Thank you. Baroness Drake, shall we move on to enforcement?
Yes, if I may, thank you very much. Can I say, I recognise that the evidence we have reveals that in England, police forces have used their coronavirus enforcement powers significantly less than in many comparable countries, and clearly that's consistent with our police force's emphasis on encouraging and educating the public. So I recognise that. But when it comes to the use of enforcement powers, most, if not all, of the charges brought under the Coronavirus Act have been brought incorrectly, which leads me to two questions. And if I could start with the first one, in your view, what factors led to wrongful arrests and charges under the coronavirus legislation?
Paddy Tipping, I don't know geographically how the cases were spread. You may not have had any, but do you want to comment on that?
There have been very few cases here in Nottinghamshire. There has been an issue around the £10,000 fine for large parties. You'll remember, Anne, that the first £10,000 fine was issued here in Nottinghamshire at a student party. Sorry to say, it wasn't the last. At one point, the APCC issued instructions that no £10,000 fine were to be issued. That guidance lasted only for a very short period of time. Those fines are now being put back into effect on the proviso that the officer issuing them makes it clear to the recipient that they've got the right to go to court. And one of the issues before us is that very few cases have gone to court, none are for £10,000 here in Nottinghamshire. I don't think anywhere in the country yet. I think there's a related question around the number of fixed penalty notices issued. Different chief constables have taken different views in different parts of the country. So here in Nottinghamshire, the issue of fixed penalty notices has been relatively low, not the bottom, but in the bottom 25%. But in other parts of the country, North Yorkshire, for example, the number issued has been a lot higher. Clearly, this is a matter for chief constables, but it does raise questions about legitimacy and comparisons right across the country.
Mr. Apter, do you want to add something?
Yes, I think, I mean, it has been really unfortunate. And whilst, you know, any error in the way that has been enforced is regrettable, I think some understanding should be given, because this understanding with the rapidly changing regulation has been a real concern. Also, the differences between the devolved governments. Some aspects are enforceable in one part of the country, others are not. That's sometimes been muddied in certain aspects. And I think it can be as simple as the Coronavirus Act versus the legislation. Simply on a form, the wrong box could have been ticked. And I think this is purely down to, you know, legislation is complex at the best of time. It's the fast-moving pace that it was introduced. I think where errors have been identified, certainly as Paddy says about the £10,000 fines and so on, there's been a pause and there's been a review, and then we've started again. But I do think overall the level of errors has been, in the whole scheme of things, has been relatively small, but you know, regrettable. And my colleagues, the last thing they want to do is add any confusion with members of the public. But they have been put sometimes in a no-win situation, if I'm honest, with some of the amount of legislative change that they've been expected to get their heads around in a very, very short space of time, often with the guidance which they depend upon coming later in the week.
Baroness Straight, did you want to follow up there? Yeah, I do. Thank you very much. I mean, charges brought under the actual regulations have been less error prone. It's clearly that the big errors have been occurring under the Coronavirus Act. But do you have a view on what the government could do, or indeed the police authorities, to prevent this situation arising in future, because there clearly was a misunderstanding of the Act, so that I think almost all, if not most of the charges brought under that Act were incorrectly brought. So what do you think the government could do, and indeed the police authorities could do?
So I think it's the point that we've made throughout the discussion, that having good communication, good notice, a chance to challenge things before they're introduced would be the right way forward. It's manifestly wrong that police officers are being asked to issue fixed penalty notices when the guidance, the professional advice behind it isn't available.
I think Paddy's summed up exactly what I was going to say, and it's also about the simplification of the legislation. Try and dovetail it in to other parts of the legislation that we already have, rather than maybe having to create new legislation, which perhaps we don't need. But be as simple as we can. Not always achievable, but certainly better than what we've had so far.
Thank you. Lord Howe, you wanted to follow up here, I think.
Hello. It's a hallowed part of our constitution that we don't have a national police force, and that chief constables are responsible for operational decisions in their own areas. But this has led to a good deal of local variability, whether it's in the policing of members of the public taking exercise, or much more significantly, policing the rising instance of domestic abuse during the pandemic. What are your thoughts on this variability? Is it an inevitable consequence of that decentralization of responsibility for policing that we regard as a very important feature of our liberal constitution? Or is it really quite concerning in terms of the problems for police to understand what their specific responsibilities are, and for the public's perception and for the relations between the public and the police?
Paddy Tipping, do you want to go first on that?
So Alan, my colleagues always tell me, and you will know this, given your own background, that things are different in Wales. And in Wales, the four police forces have worked more closely together, and there's been greater contact, I think, with the Welsh government. And I think there's been more uniformity in Wales than anywhere else in the country. But I think it's inevitable that police will function in different ways in different parts of the country. That's part of our constitution. Is it a major issue? Given the scale, if you compare the number of fixed penalty notices issued across the country, I'm not sure that the variation is so wide that causes concern. But I know that Martin Hewitt, the chair of the Police Chiefs Council, has regularly talked with Chief Constable colleagues around this, and not issuing instructions, but trying to get a degree of consensus about the way forward.
Mr. Apter, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, just to add, the 43 force model we have across England and Wales, localism is really important. There's always been discussions and debates as to what's right and what doesn't work. The view of the Police Federation was, certainly early on in this crisis, was the 43 force model. There was always going to be differences in forces. But in times of crisis, national crisis such as this, where so much pressure is focused within policing and law enforcement, it would have been probably easier, but we don't give ourselves easy to work with, for the National Chiefs Council to maybe have the ability to insist rather than advise. But I think, despite the difficulties that we've encountered, there is always going to be a difference, and Paddy rightly says that Wales has worked really well with the forces within Wales, but there are differences, whether it's in Kent versus Merseyside. The differences can be polar opposite to the style of policing we need, but there are certain things in times of crisis I think we need to be more consistent on, and I would have liked to have seen that emphasised a little bit more.
Okay, Lord Howell wants to come in at this stage.
Yes, what we've heard is utterly sensible and realistic. But can we take it that if the Police Federation is brought properly into the circle of trust, to use your phrase, they would be opposed to such propositions as that all track and trace information of people's devices should be handed to the police, which was one suggestion, which would create impossible policing judgments and difficulties, or pitching things a little wider. One of the latest horrors running around is that remarks within the privacy of the home should somehow, if captured, be a matter for police investigation, which again raises a whole prospect of impossible situations for the police. Will the Police Federation stay in the circle of trust, and please take a very practical view on these matters as you've taken on everything else?
I think that's widening out some of our discussion, but John Apter, I think that was primarily for you.
Yes, I think when you're inside the discussion, and look, just because we have, and during the pandemic, and I have to say since I've been in post, we have had a constructive relationship with the Home Office officials, the National Chiefs Council. That doesn't mean to say we're always going to agree. Sometimes we fundamentally disagree and we will challenge. And the same could be said for this, and forgive me, I don't know the details of some of the examples you give, but in times of crisis, and we have done this during this year, during this pandemic year, of course, the Police Federation, we have looked at things which is in the national interest, which is clearly in the interests of our members. And we've done everything we can to make sure that relationship between policing and the public remains intact. If there are things that we might be fundamentally opposed to, of course we would challenge in a constructive way. But we've got to be within the discussion to be able to disagree or not.
Paddy, is there anything you want to say about Crime Commissioners' relationships as a way of rounding up your contribution?
Police and Crime Commissioners are an interesting and eclectic bunch of people. I was smiling when the question was asked about speaking for the Federation. John knows as chair of the Federation, it's not always easy for him to speak with one voice, and that's the same for Police and Crime Commissioners. We all come from different places, but look, we've learned things from this crisis. It's been really difficult, but the way it's pushed us to move towards new technology, realising the importance of neighbourhood policing, the need for partnership working, those are all really positive things that have come out of it. And Anne, you may not have caught up with this, but the Inspector of Constabulary have issued this morning their first letter around the policing of COVID. The final report won't be available to January, but actually it paints a very positive picture of what the police have done. Sure, it highlights some difficulties, but it reflects the fact that all of us have tried to work really hard together with the wider community to help us get through this. And I think there'll be a sigh of relief when we finally all get through it together.
Right, thank you very much indeed. That's a good note to end on. And thank you for your evidence this morning. I think we've probably kept you slightly longer than anticipated, but that's probably because you had a lot to say that we wanted to hear. So thank you, and I'll